I'll give it a minute. Okay, so it is looking good with interpretation and recording. So, 1 second. Mhm. So on our first slide, we have introductions. So like I said at the very beginning, my name is Alma Urbano. I'm the grants manager for Chinook Fund. We will also have later on Trina Moya, who's our finance and operations manager, and here with us in the background, but also in the forefront, Hannah Rose as our admin assistant. Thank you. And Hannah Rose will also be checking the chat because I'm not able to see it all from my end. But feel free to leave questions. We might need to wait halfway through and maybe towards the end to answer all of them. But if there's something relevant or something quick, please do put it in the chat. So to start, if you wouldn't mind, or if you are interested or able to, we'd love to see who is in the space with us. So if you want to put in your name, maybe your pronouns in your organization, just so we know who's in the space. But it's okay if you're not interested in doing that. That is also fine. So give it a second, and thank you all for being here. So I'll start. Oh, I see people. Thank you all for sharing in the chat. We will be recording, so I will have also the captions available for you as well as the PowerPoint as we get started to follow along. But do let us know if you need quick adjustments throughout or if other questions come up regarding the PowerPoint. We'll move on to our workshop goals. We already did introductions via chat, but we will also do a quick history of Chinook Fund. We will be going over how we fund the grant making process, so through the Giving Project. We will also go over the grant making criteria, what we do and what we do not fund. A little bit of community organizing because we do focus on community organizing as an organization and as a foundation. So that's a very important portion. And then I'll do a quick, hopefully thorough walkthrough of the actual application website where you will submit your applications if you decide to submit an application. And then there'll be some contact information and deadline information at the end as well. We will also have timeline information earlier on. But for quick history on Chinook, we've been around over 30 years, I believe. So we come from a legacy of wealthy, progressive, younger people around mostly the 80s, but the people who got together decided that they wanted to fund social justice initiatives while they were also being community activists themselves. So they were following on the roots of the 60s and 70s civil rights efforts throughout the US. And that's kind of the very, very basic history of Chinook Fund. But after that, or as part of that, we were funded also as part of the Funding Exchange, which is no longer active, but they were a big philanthropy effort to center community grant making as part of social progressive movements. And we also started from the Giving Project model from there. But at the very beginning, we were a grant making committee only until 2016, which is when we started the Giving Project more solidly. Initially, the grant making committee was mostly making grant making decisions. They were doing the work themselves, so they were activists in their communities. But in order to get more funding, as funding was running out, they decided to include fundraising as part of that grant making committee. And that kind of led to the Giving Project. The Giving Project is a national effort. We're part of the Giving Project Network, which is, I believe, in 7 other states, but we're the only Giving Project as it is defined in Colorado. So there's no other efforts like ours. And that is because it's also pretty tough and intensive commitment. So a little bit more on the before that, a quick introduction to our mission. Chinook Fund seeks community-led systemic change by mobilizing resources for and trusting in grassroots social justice organizations across Colorado. And back to the Giving Project. So this is the group of people who actually get to fund and make grant-making decisions. So the Giving Project runs usually twice a year, so it's the same time as the grant-making cycle. So for this fall, we will actually have a grant-making committee made up of alumni who've done the GP project in the past. But typically, this is a new group of volunteers who already do their own community work and believe in social justice efforts in their communities in their own way. But they join us for about 6 months to actually, fundraise and build their own skills. So they're also getting political education. So they're learning across race and class backgrounds a little bit of what it means for society and philanthropy to fund social justice movements. So a little bit of community organizing. A lot of the work they also learn is around fundraising, like using organizing model to fundraise for the groups that they want to fund. So at the same time that they're reading your applications or the applications of the organizations that are applying, they're also fundraising and they're also engaging with each other on these tough conversations amongst themselves and with our facilitation. But that is the reason that it is a longer process, and you'll see the timeline in a second. But it's usually 15 people who read the applications, and it is over 3 phases. So this is kind of a quick summary of the timeline. So for people applying on September 15th, that is the deadline. Then we do a pre-screening right before we go into the Giving Project, but all of that happens around October. And then if you're selected for a site visit, you would hear back around November and into December. Final decisions happen around mid-January, and final notifications happen in February or March. If we decide, or if the committee, either the Giving Project, decision makers, in this case, the grant making committee, decides that your organization is not going to get funded earlier in the process, you will hear from us earlier in the process. But if you do get funded, you won't hear from us on a final notification until closer to March. Checking in with Hannah Rose if there are any questions so far. Sounds good. We'll get started with funding guidelines. So we do have our specific set of criteria that we focus on, and these are requirements. So if we, as we read your application, see that the criteria is not fully met or it's not going to make it further into the Giving Project process, then it's probably along these things or eligibility, which I'll also go into first, actually. So first, to be eligible, you must be operating in the state of Colorado or be a regional indigenous group that kind of boundaries into the state of Colorado. And then you also have to have a budget of $350K per year or less. So typically smaller organizations. And you'll see once I go through the actual website how this comes up as you log in. We'd also ask that if you already received a declination during the last application cycle, so that was spring 2025, that you wait until the next, this should say spring 2026, sorry. But that you wait until the next cycle that you got declined from next year to apply. But if you did not apply on the last cycle, which was spring 2025, you are eligible to apply on this cycle, fall 2025.
Hey,
But let me know if,
Alpha,
yes.
sorry, we have one question in the chat.
Go for it.
Lisa asks, do you fund organizations that also provide services remotely rather than in person?
You mean remotely as in you're out of Colorado? Is that the concern?
As in online.
Oh. I think we'll might need to check in later or chat. But the organization itself should be based in Colorado, even if and the people receiving services would still need to be in Colorado too. Because we're such a small community foundation, we really have to limit ourselves with Colorado. But if there's other things, so if it is an indigenous run organization, that crosses our boundary into Colorado, we can also check in and see if you would be eligible. But feel free to leave your contact and I can reach out to check in. Any other questions? For the next part, I'll go over the things Chinook Fund does not typically fund. So we don't fund direct services to individuals. This includes fundings. So direct funding to individuals. So if the main focus of your application is about providing funds, the funds that we provide to you directly to other individuals, kind of as pass-through funding, that would not be as eligible. And would probably not make it through the final round of decision making. But this also includes if your organization only does direct services without the other criteria. And I'll go more into this one later on because it does have some caveats. But we do not fund for sure groups that have annual budgets of 350K or more per year. We also do not fund or try not to fund organizations or individuals controlled by one individual. So if it's just one person who's applying for their particular project, then it's unlikely that we would get funding to that person. Or if an organization is fundraising for one person to receive funding. And then we don't typically fund the scholarship requests. So if there's a school that's trying to, a private school, that it's trying to give a scholarship to a student and they're applying to us for that purpose, they would not receive funding from us. So we also typically don't fund profit-making organizations or businesses, with the exception of worker-owned cooperatives. So if you are a worker-owned cooperative, I'll go more into details as to how we define that, but we'll need to also check in to make sure you meet our definition there, because it would be a little different than our typical applicant. We also typically don't fund other foundations or pass-through funding, like I mentioned, unless there's like a community organizing portion of that it's separate enough from the funding itself. And we also don't fund organizations whose work or decision-making body is based outside of Colorado. Again, with the exception of potential regional indigenous groups that have territory that overlaps into, or the work in territory that overlaps into Colorado boundaries. And we do not want to influence the election of individuals for public office. Questions, if any? go into some definitions. You may already know these, but it's helpful for us to make sure we go over these together. We do ask that you have a 501(c)(3) status or a fiscal sponsor with the similar 501(c)(3) or other charity designated status. For most projects, or if you want to check in with us, if you want to apply as a worker-owned co-op, then we may also be able to accept your application. But we still would want your work to be helpful to the community beyond making profit. So it would still need to be some form of charity work or work that is beneficial to the community. And then our definition is also very simple. A worker cooperative is simply a business owned and managed by its workers. So typically they have members and they all vote on their board and how they make decisions as a collective. And if they were to get disbanded, they would also have to split or decide collectively on a process on how to split the profit that they've already made, if they have any profit. So do check in with us if that's how you want to apply. Otherwise, we do typically require a 501(c)(3) or fiscally sponsor, or to have a fiscal sponsor. So we do take, or we have two options that people can apply to. We have the general operating and project support. Both of these go into the same docket. So there's no general operating docket only or project support docket only. It's all, they're all viewed collectively. We typically recommend you apply for general operating unless you have a project that meets our criteria more than your collective efforts. So if you do something that may not have as much potential in making it to our final rounds, but you have a smaller project within your organization that you think meets all our criteria very strongly, then you are welcome to submit your application for a project support. But we're still going to view the entire organization. So we're still going to view how you describe your mission, maybe a little history of the organization with a focus on your project. But we're still going to look at your leadership as well. Our options are for funding our startup of $4,000, sorry, or establish of $10,000, and you get to define how you want to apply. So typically grants that are less than 4 years old, we encourage to apply for a startup grant. But we've had established grants who apply for startup, or we've have established organizations that have been around for more than 4 years that still apply for startup. And we've had younger organizations sometimes apply for established grants. The main thing to keep in mind, established grants are typically more competitive. So we're looking at your record more so than if you were a startup organization or a project. And typically, if you're established grant, you're also competing with typically groups that have already been funded in the past. But we don't look at which grant you applied until we look at how much we raised. So how much the given project was able to fundraise. So that's on the almost the second to last or last session. So it doesn't become a big priority until we get to the final decisions, because we don't know how much funding we have until then. However, when the amount you are applying for is typically the amount we do. If we are to fund you, that is the amount you're getting. So even if you submit a really strong startup application that could have been an established application, you're only eligible for whatever you applied for at the beginning. So quick general application details. We will ask for a fiscal sponsor agreement if you have a fiscal sponsor to meet the 501c3 eligibility. Otherwise, if you have your own 501c3 or your own charity status, we won't ask for this. We also ask for leadership bios of the organization or the fiscal sponsor project. And then we also ask for a diversity chart. And I'll go more into how that looks. We used to have a Chinook Fund financials form. Now it's questions on the application. And I'll also show when I will do the walkthrough of our website. Or you can still submit 3 documents of your own. But you're welcome to look at the questions and see which things we're actually looking for so you don't scramble for 3 documents. However, if you already have your documents of your previous and current fiscal year budgets and statements, then you're also still welcome to submit those. I recommend you submit the questions, but you have options. Okay, questions there before I go into our criteria. Okay, water. We can keep going. So the criteria that we do focus on, one second, is constituent-led, community-wide, and lasting effect. So this is what we use when we look at the pre-screening. So we do staff, board members, and sometimes another community member close to Chinook will look at the applications before we forward it to the Giving Project, just to make sure they're still meeting eligibility. So Colorado budget, and then criteria. So if they don't meet any of our criteria, or they're working on something completely different from what Chinook funds, then it's likely to not make it to the next round of decision making, which is the Giving Project. So things we start looking up after eligibility are these things. To start with constituent-led, we define that by work that is led by the people most impacted by the injustice. So we believe that those most affected by injustice have the vision and solutions for their own liberation. So this means that the people who would most be, I don't know if beneficiaries is the right word, but who would be most impacted by your project are those people at the forefront making those leadership decisions. So things like funding, things like hiring, if you're able to hire, things like the future of the project, are those people making those decisions. So the questions you will see in our application are who is most impacted. So it could be different people. It's not a monolithic on who could be the most impacted by your project, but who is most impacted by the injustice you're fighting. So you'll be able to share that. And then how are these most affected people actively providing leadership to your work? How do you identify and develop new leaders? An example of that, if you were to be a youth-based organization, we will ask, how are youth voices being incorporated into leadership? So in this case, if you're a youth program, youth would be the most impacted, or if you label that as being the most impacted, then do you have a youth advisory board or other decision-making body where youth are integrated into that process? Our next criteria that we focus very, sorry, I lost my slide. One second. Our next criteria is community-wide. So we look at intersectionality, work that reflects as many members of the constituency and community as possible. So this doesn't mean all members, but that's how we define it here. So work reflects all members of the constituency and community, particularly those who experience multiple forms of oppression. So you don't have to meet everyone in your community to some capacity with your project or involve everyone, but we do want to see clear efforts that you are including people who are especially facing multiple forms of oppression or who would not otherwise be included in something like your project. And we define that with like intersectionality and how you communicate that in your narrative. So a question related to that would be, how do you define diversity within your constituency? So it may be very different from how another applicant defines their diversity within their work. But how do you ensure that as many people, especially those with less privilege, are incorporated into your project or your decision-making process? So we have space for you to describe that in your application materials, like your diversity chart, and then you'll have space in the narrative portions to talk about other areas, and maybe some challenges in how you've processed those or your efforts around that. Our next one is lasting effect. So we want to see work that is meaningful to your community, particularly for future generations. So it doesn't need to be transformative for the entire state of Colorado for the next 5 years, but it should have something that the people or the community in leadership define as transformative for the next generation, at least within maybe their community. So this could be, however you define community, it could be a small, maybe 2 towns, 1 town, a small community project, as long as it's not one individual. So if it is transformative and incredible and shifting generations to one individual, we typically would not fund if that's what we get from the application. But if it's at least a community of constituent-led efforts that try to include as many community-wide and define lasting effect to some extent, beyond individual needs, then that would make it a stronger application. So things you will be asked that may help you narrate that would be, what socioeconomic, political, cultural institutions or systems will you work to change in order to fight the injustices? What actions will come out of your work? What difference will it make in your community? And then this is very visionary, but if you could imagine or has your community imagine how it will impact them in 15 years out, that would be a good reflection space as well.
Hi, Alma.
Yes.
We have one more question in the chat about inside or outside Colorado. Lisa asks, we say we don't fund organizations whose decision-making body is based outside of Colorado. If some members of the organization's board are outside of Colorado, does that disqualify the organization, even if other board members are in Colorado?
I think we will probably still look at the address of your organization. So where is your organization physically at? Regardless of with constituent leadership, we would look at the Colorado background of your board members, because that is space for you to share that. But it's hard for me. I think if it's just with this limited information that I have, it may not be eligible. If you think that enough leadership is outside of Colorado making decisions for the organization. But yeah, but there is a space to talk a little bit more on that. I think it also, because we will go over financials, we will look at where you're registered and if the state of Colorado has like your information as part of their records. But that's when we look more at financials as well. So we can check in after, or if you want to leave your contact information, and we can go over the specific case. But typically, we do ask the majority of decision makers are in Colorado. I'll continue with guidelines. So in summary, all successful applicants must be based in communities facing injustice, have some form of democratic leadership. So this is where the constituent leadership portion comes in, where the decision making is led and accountable to those directly impacted by the issue. They're engaging in some way, dismantling privilege and oppression within their organization and community. And they're demonstrating that their work can lead to permanent or progressive change in their communities in the long term. It's also how you communicate your work and which portions of your work you decide to uplift. And if you're applying for a project, how the project fits into the criteria better than your entire organization, if that's the case. Otherwise, we look at your whole group and organization. For funding priorities. So we looked at criteria, that's the requirements. Priorities are not requirements, and you might fit into one of these requirements and still not get funding because we're still looking at criteria as the main guideline for decision making. However, these are still important to us, to Chinook Fund and to Chinook Fund's community. So they do get special consideration or just a little bit more space for conversation to really look at what you're applying for with your application. So things we want or try to prioritize intentionally are rural organizations. So it would be rural Colorado, community organizing efforts, and then Black-led or Native-led organizations. So again, these are not requirements, but we at Chinook Fund give it intentional consideration and more space for conversation when we make decisions to address maybe some nuance around the application. However, we still look at criteria as well. So again, these are not requirements. Our definition of rural. So special consideration is given to groups outside of the Front Range, which means to us, rural organizations are not in Boulder, Denver, Colorado Springs, or Fort Collins. At least that's how we categorize them. And then our definition for community organizing is the process of bringing affected people together to use their collective power to win improvements in their community and change the power structure to advance social justice. And I'll have more examples later on about that. And then we also give attention to Black liberation efforts. So we try to prioritize Black-led anti-oppression efforts, including but not limited to economic justice, community control, or reparation efforts. And we also try to give consideration to Indigenous sovereignty efforts. So those may include promoting Native American human rights, holding government accountable to Native laws, and or preserving tribal existence. And there are other efforts that may fit into these categories. Or community organizing. This is the definition we also work from. So this is from Groundswell Fund. And typically community organizing work has a grassroots base of support. They have a strategic direction driven by that base. So they have membership or they have a group of neighbors, tenants, youth, who are strategizing to make clear demands either for policy or systems change, either within their communities or beyond. They typically have a power maps, which is just like deciding who are they making demands from. So typically officials or people in power who they're trying to reach to make significant change or to make a different or a decision that will help community. And they typically create more leaders amongst themselves. So there is a leadership ladder of some extent of people becoming members doing community organizing and then helping their neighbor become a community organizer in their way. Again, this is not a requirement. This is just kind of broadly how we view it as Chinook Fund, if you were to apply for this priority or under this priority category. Any questions, comments? Mostly questions.
We have one question in the chat. Harmony asks, can the nonprofit I run apply for a grant and also be a fiscal sponsor for an Indigenous cultural preservation group?
I think for our application process, if you're trying to fit into that priority area, that is the group that would need to apply with you as their fiscal sponsor, if that's what you're getting, or if that's the priority area you're trying to meet. Otherwise, there is a space to talk about your own work in those communities. But typically, if you're wanting to apply under the Indigenous-led priority area, it is that group that would need to apply for themselves, and then you would be their fiscal sponsor. Otherwise, you can apply as your own, and you don't have to meet that priority area to be considered. Any other questions? Find the chat. Let's continue. So I will give some examples of what we do not prioritize. So those would be the circles on the right. Because we already said we prioritize community organizing. We define it as different from direct services, from education and advocacy, and from empowerment. So an example of not a priority of Chinook Fund would be services. Services on their own, especially. But we define those as supplying basic services to people who need them, often to meet basic needs such as food, healthcare, shelter, or transportation. An example of that would be a community-based health center that provides health support for their community. They, on their own, if they're providing financial support or health services, that alone would not get the application far into the process unless it has other things added to it. But we as an organization have been intentional to not make services, direct services on their own, a priority. We understand that these are very much needed services and oftentimes led by community members. We just want to name that we don't make the services themselves a priority. However, if you do meet the constituent leadership, if it is driven by community for community, if there is lasting effect beyond providing direct services for the immediate need, and you're able to communicate that, then the rest of the criteria will carry their application further in the process. But again, services on their own are not a priority. Education advocacy. So if you're raising visibility of a cause or advocating for or against a policy on behalf of other people or on behalf of another group that's most impacted or more impacted, then that would also not be a priority on its own for us. So we're looking at any national organization dedicated to accessibility of health services, any lobbying. Well, lobbying itself already would probably not make your application eligible. But the main thing why this is not a priority for us is that they lack community members in leadership. So even if you're making a really good effort and you have a really great campaign, if the people most impacted are not at the upfront, like at the leadership of the effort, they're not driving the funding decisions, the messaging, the other community members involved, then it's not a priority for us because we want to prioritize community-led efforts. Our last not priority is empowerment. So we define this by providing programs that focus on supporting positive identity and self-esteem amongst marginalized groups. So oftentimes we see applications for youth groups or after-school programs for youth where youth are not included in the decision-making, but they do receive services that help them and their confidence as youth and as adults growing up in this society. However, that effort alone would not be a priority unless they are led by the youth themselves and they're figuring out how they're making a lasting effect for their community and how maybe they are working amongst themselves, but how is that work amongst themselves impacting the rest of their community, not just them as individual people. So an example that on its own would not be a priority would be like a high school group of students that are paired with program graduates as mentors. And they do some community service projects of them empowering themselves or other youth, but they're not addressing how it's constituent-led, how it's community-wide, or how it's lasting effect beyond their individual growth as youth. So again, our priority instead is community organizing. One, because in Colorado and across the US, most funding does not go to community organizing. It barely gets to the efforts affecting people long term, but community organizing is even less of a priority for most foundations. So we, with our small community foundation, we do try to emphasize community organizing and how it's different than services, or how it's different than empowerment, or how it's different than advocacy on its own. Again, it's the process of bringing affected people together to use their collective power to win improvements in their community and change the power structure to advance social justice. That was a lot. So any questions? I'll have other examples of community organizing that may also fit, or that for you to consider as you apply. So a quick example of something that has been funded in the past, many years ago, when they were way smaller than they are now, is this organization called Powerful Family. So this is a fiction, but also based on a real organization. But for this scenario, it's a fictional story about an organization that is led by women of color committed to reproductive justice in rural Colorado. So they're doing grassroots community organizing. They're amplifying the voices of those often unheard, particularly those facing issues such as access to abortion or contraception. They are people involved in their communities already, and they're working with neighbors to do listening sessions, and they're trying to create a comprehensive report on their community and their needs. The report on its own would not be as much of a successful application, but because they're doing it in partnerships with their community members and they're mobilizing to some extent, including mobilizing people who would not otherwise be mobilized, like undocumented immigrants or people who don't have access to health services like Medicaid, because they're mobilizing from the ground in that sense, then they would get at least meeting this priority area, which is community organizing. We would still need to look at the constituent leadership, community-wide, or lasting effect portions. But once they meet that, then they would, to an extent, meet this criteria. And this is just a rough example. Another example of community organizing, or something we consider within the branch of community organizing, is cultural organizing. So, and this has a lot to do with heritage, almost heritage organizing or cultural focus, in that this is oftentimes cultural organizing integrating arts and culture into organizing strategies. So it is about organizing from a particular tradition, cultural identity, community of place, or worldview. Again, it still fits somewhat of the other criteria in terms of being, being led by the people most impacted by what they're doing, but also exercising their power to find their own communities and use that as a form of resistance. So in this case, or one organization that might fit into this criteria is the mission of Denver Black Queer Collective, which is to provide protective, supportive, and uplifting space for Black queer or queer Black people in Colorado community. They provide collective joy, healing, and safety, queer resistance, and effective activism. So we do use these examples because community organizing may not look like organizing around policy or organizing around specific services or things like that. It may be about uplifting communities that have their own or define their own power amongst themselves, because they have faced injustice and are trying to move or organize from that point of view. We also look at healing justice, if that's something the organization does, which is how oppressed communities holistically respond and intervene on generational trauma and violence, and how they innovate collective practices that can impact and transform the consequences of oppression on their bodies, hearts, and minds. So similar to the previous example, but healing justice focus on the idea that healing doesn't always come from the traditional Western medicine style. But then in the community organizing doesn't always define lasting effect as policy or mostly policy or big systemic change. It can also be within communities, or how are they addressing internalized oppression in a way. And also, so many times it's healing justice comes from or is tied to cultural organizing. This is an example that would fit into this criteria, at least for this slide. There's an Indigenous World Variety program in Cortez led by people most impacted by it, but they provide a space for those in substance abuse recovery with compassion, cultural identity, and utilizing a model by a member of their community, or by a program that their community members have identified as successful. So other considerations, similar, are how we would define like stronger applications. So they're able to demonstrate in their application how they work with long-term vision that is clearly linked to current milestones. So there'll be a space you will be asked to write about your milestones. Definitely focus on the work you're doing. Sometimes people apply their milestones as how much they're going to raise by next year, or getting an office, which are really great and big milestones for the organization. But we want to look at how that impacts your long-term vision, or how you're involving the constituent leadership, community-wide, and lasting effect into those milestones, or how they're going to move forward your vision.
Hey, Alma, we have one question in the chat
Yeah.
about healing justice, and it says the concept of healing justice for trauma is not considered a direct service. Is that correct? Or is it more nuanced than that?
Right, that is, there's definitely some nuance to that, but in very basic, quick terms, yeah, that's correct. We define healing justice as different than direct services, because at least the way we see it when we read applications, direct services on their own are often not provided by the people most impacted, but healing justice are usually, or includes a component of community healing. So usually the people they're in close community to, or people impacted, or people close to the people impacted. But that is our very, very specific definition that may not always be clear. And we have those conversations. So because we have the Giving Project, there are spaces for that conversation to take time and space, and people don't make immediate decisions. That's why we do take the 6 months to read the applications as well. Any other questions? So what was, so typically the strongest applications have achieved some form of success in the past that has positively impacted their community, and they see themselves as part of a larger movement. So they're not isolated, or they're able to communicate how they're part of a larger community, a larger effort. They also sometimes, or we hope most times, offer alternatives to existing institutions and systems that perpetuate injustice. So oftentimes we believe that smaller projects or smaller organizations sometimes come up with more creative solutions on how to address specific issues in their community. And sometimes because of that, they're not often funded by typical foundations. So we do try to look at that, which is the same as they're taking some form of risk. This may no longer be, well, I don't know what I was going to say, but oftentimes our projects are taking a risk in addressing social justice efforts. So I'll leave that. If you want to look at our past grantees, we do have the last 2 cycles, I believe. So you're able to see the type of projects that have been funded in the past. That doesn't mean that if a similar project comes, it will be funded, but they're typically examples of criteria and priority combined. So they're good places to look at, do your research. We don't have focus areas. So you're not limited by that. That does make it a little difficult to make final decisions depending on the docket that we receive, because we don't have a priority focus area besides our priorities. But you don't have to meet our priorities to get funding. You can have your own efforts within any and other types of work. So anything from workers' rights to immigrant rights, racial justice, youth organizing, however that looks for your community, civic engagement. So there's different types of work that you can apply under or for. Okay. Questions before we do the walkthrough of our website? Okay. If there are other questions, please put them in the chat. It's going to take me a quick second to pull up. How do I do this? Well, I'll try. You'll see a historic. So when you go to our website, oh, wait. Hopefully all of you know our website is, but I'll walk you in 1 minute. So first, oh, can everyone see my screen? Okay. Trying to do many things. Okay. So if you go, 1 second. So this is our Chinook Fund website. You will click on their grants and then go to how to apply. When you go in, it's gonna ask you, actually, before I go in, let me do the slides first. It's gonna look like this. So it's gonna ask you to create a new account first. And then you also have the option to select the language. So we do recommend that from the beginning, you select the language. We are only able to read in Spanish and English, but you have the option, if it helps you, to select via Google Translate the language that works for you to read through the application questions. But just so you know, we are only able to do it in English and Spanish, or we would need to use another translate services to translate your responses. So this is how it looks. You will click on create new account. Select language. I'm able to show you, but it's going to ask you for your organization information from the very beginning. So it's going to say things like name of your organization, address, EIN number, primary contact if it's someone else besides yourselves, your own individual user information. So that's mostly your name, email, and password. And then you'll click create account. Please follow the password requirements and make sure you save it. Otherwise, I can create another password if you are if you forget your password or need help throughout the early stages or any stage of the application process. But as a reminder, your account ID or your username will be your email address. Quick note, if you think you have a profile with our grant making system or our website where you apply, please check in with us. We might be able to give you the login or create a login, I mean, for you with the same history as your application. This is just to make sure if your application has received funding in the past, and that's a consideration for the Giving Project, that we match your profile to the historic record of your organization. But otherwise, you're able to make your account, and if you think there's already an account, we can combine them. So they're under one group. Okay, the first thing you're gonna see is the eligibility quiz. So now I'm gonna go here because I open a historic fake, almost fake applicant. So once you log in, it should look a version of this. You have to actually go to apply to find the eligibility quiz. And you can, let me see if I can click on it. So there'll be some information. This cycle opened in July 15th, so that's why it says that. But our deadline is September 15th. This person was eligible, so you don't get to see, but the question is, or we're the same thing. So it will ask you to submit a number for the budget. So we consider annual budget to be your annual expenses. So the same thing. So that number has to be under 350K. Otherwise, the system itself will close itself. It won't let you apply. You also have to select, let me find the PowerPoint again. You also have to select that you're based in Colorado, or there's another option for regional indigenous group with potential territory that overlaps into Colorado boundaries. Let me go back here. So once you get through that, if you're eligible, it should let you see this box. Let me know if you run into issues. Sometimes people put in the wrong or clicks the wrong options when they meant to submit something else. Or sometimes if you're a previous grantee already, it might not let you do this again. So check in with me to see if you're still eligible to apply. And I can go in and set it up. But otherwise you'll see this portion. It will say pretty much what I've been sharing. So community organizing, healing justice, criteria. A reminder that we do not, or we're not able to fund anything involving electoral campaigns. We do not support lobbying at the state, federal, or local levels. And we also don't support private interests, which is essentially what I shared earlier. Okay, but you click apply. This one says you already have a request because I tested it out earlier. So sometimes you will see this. So you would just click view request or apply again. It would just create another application for you. Again, this is how I'll look. Oh, I forgot to do the language. So again, you're able to scroll down to Spanish if that's the language that you need. Up there. Huh? Okay. So for an instance, you'll see it in Spanish. But essentially, it's the mission. It's going to ask when your organization was founded. Let me go back. Oh, am I able to go back? I may need to select English again. I will translate. So these are all the questions. Make sure you know that you can download a PDF if that helps you. So it will say maybe question list. You can download the questions ahead of time and then you can copy them over to a Word document to save your responses. It should save for you every 30 minutes, but I would have your narrative questions, because those are sometimes long, saved somewhere else just in case. But otherwise you're able to also make sure you can just click save application and you'll be able to edit. You won't be able to edit after you click submit application. So please keep that in mind unless there's enough time before the deadline where I can go back and open it for you. Otherwise, if it's close to the deadline, it's going to be tougher for you to edit if you accidentally click submit application before you meant to. It's going to ask you earlier on if you're based in the Front Range. You know now, because we prioritize groups not in the Front Range in Colorado. So it's gonna ask you that earlier on. It's gonna, if you have fiscal sponsor, it's gonna ask you for a fiscal sponsor. I found it. If not, you won't even get that question. You get to select startup, establish, the amount. Again, we've had people fill in $7,000 for establish grant. We recommend you just select 4,000 or 10,000. Where will it be spent? There's a category for history. So when did your group come together and why? Root causes. So this is just to contextualize and see your theory of change almost. Action and lasting effect, constituent leadership, community-wide, decision-making, movement building. We do ask for funding or community support in terms of how does your community support your organization, just to see if you're connected to community and how is your community aware of you and if applicable. So you can also share any pending grants, but that is not necessary. We're not looking for your fundraising plan. We're looking for how does community invest in you, or you see yourself, or you see them investing in your organization. There's other questions, milestones. Make sure you select add another milestone. It will tell you because it's a requirement. 3 milestones is fine. We just ask that you do somewhat of this format. So for instance, by July, it says July 2025, but imagine whenever you're applying, if you have a date, July 2026, you intend to involve or grow your base by 35 community individuals by doing this and that. So maybe doing a community, growing your leadership so they're able to include more people in their community. Do try to provide some examples. You have 2,000 characters. You don't have to use the full 2,000 characters. That is a lot, but some people already have grants where they've talked about their milestones and they have a big narrative. So we hope you're able to adjust your question to our application, but it's there to give you freedom in how much you share. It's not there as the minimum. So you don't need to give us the 2,000 characters for any of the questions. It will, we'll go over financial form in a second, but I'll show it. We recommend the financial form. That just means it puts up questions for you. Actually, we might just jump to that. There's also a section to upload your leadership bios, diversity chart, and references. We know your references are people who like your organization, but we do call them if you make it to the final round. We don't call them earlier in the process. Okay, let me see the slides for financials just to make sure. Okay, questions while I'm on the portal. Are there any questions? Okay, let me just make sure I didn't miss things. Okay, if you're having trouble with the application, definitely reach out to us. You can email me at grants@chinookfen.org. You think I cover most of this. Okay, financials. Trina, are you around?
Yes, I am. Hi, everyone. I'm Trina. I'm the Finance and Operations Manager with Chinook Fen. So I'll go through both the financial form and then just some basic information if you decide to submit, if you already have your financial statements done and you just want to submit them rather than answering the few questions on our form, you can do that. So just going to review those things with you. So yeah, so first of all, just so everybody's, I understand that some of you are like new organizations, you may not have an accountant or a bookkeeper, you know, on your staff or available. So I just want to make sure, go over some basics to make sure everybody understands what we mean by certain things. So by fiscal year, we mean it's any 12-month accounting period that you use for your tax reporting purposes. So for most organizations, they follow a calendar year, so January through December. But some organizations follow different fiscal years, like Chinook Fund. Our fiscal year is July 1st through June 30th. So it's not always a calendar year, but that's the most common. So that's what we mean by fiscal year, whatever your organization's 12-month accounting period is. Next slides, please. So this is our financial form. If you choose to fill that out as opposed to submitting your own statements. If this is your very first year and you don't have a prior fiscal year, you will just enter the same start date for both prior and current fiscal year. And then just enter zeros under the prior fiscal year column. But if it's not your first fiscal year, then this first column, the prior fiscal year column, you would enter the start of that fiscal year. So if you're on a calendar year, it would be January 1st, 2024. That would be your last, whoops. Oh, okay. Sorry. No, that's fine. Go ahead. I'm not controlling the slide. So yeah. Yeah, so the first column, this is your previous completed fiscal year. So actually 7/1/25 would not be the date that would be entered in there. If you, like I said, if you're on a calendar year, it would be January 1st, 2024. And then for the next three, we just want a total figure. So what was your total income in your last completed fiscal year? What were your total expenses? And then what was your net income or loss? So it would just be income minus expenses. If it's negative, then it's a net loss. All right, let's go to next slide. Oh,
Sorry. Did you want this slide again or forward?
no, that's okay. Okay. And then below that, this is still for your prior fiscal year. We want the ending date of your prior fiscal year. So again, if it was if you're on a calendar year, it would be 12/31/24. And then we just want to know, what was your total bank balance as of that date? So we're just interested to know, like, how much cash on hand did you have at the end of your last fiscal year? And then depending on when you actually submit your application, we also want to know what the date of the most recent month end was. So if let's say you submit it on the deadline of September 15th, then that would be August 31st. And we want to know what your total bank balance was as of August 31st. Are there any questions on that prior fiscal year information? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Oh, did we not have separate ones for current year?
Oh, no, I think it was just these.
Okay. So let's look at this slide then, just so I can just clarify. So then in addition to prior fiscal year, you'll have your current fiscal year, the date that starts. So again, if it's calendar year, that would be January 1st, 2025. And then what is your, since 2025 is not over yet, what was your total budgeted income for the year? And then the next line would be your total budgeted expenses for the year. And then again, the final line would be your budgeted net income or net loss. So your total budgeted income minus budgeted expenses. Okay, now we can go forward. If you choose not to complete our form, the other option is to submit your own financial reports. So these are the 3 reports that would be required: your balance sheet as of your last completed fiscal year, your income statement for your last completed fiscal year, and your budget for your current fiscal year. The balance sheet is also known as the statement of financial position. So if you're on a calendar fiscal year, it should be dated as of December 31st, 2024. Your income statement is also known as your profit and loss or statement of operations. So if you're on a calendar year, it would cover the 12 months of January 1st through December 31st, 2024. And your budget is for your current fiscal year. So again, if you're on a calendar year, it would be January 1st through December 31st, 2025. So those are your 2 options: fill out that form or submit these 3 reports. And if we get your application and you submitted, let's say, 2 balance sheets instead of a balance sheet and an income statement, we'll reach back out to you and just ask you for the corrected documents. So next slide, please. So just again, because I know some of you are new, are maybe not familiar with financial reports, just to be clear about what we mean by these different reports, just provided some samples. So this is a sample balance sheet. It is as of a specific date, and it should be as of your last fiscal year end. And it lists your assets, your liabilities, and then the difference between the 2, which is your net assets or your net assets. So this is just an example. You don't have to list, you don't have to have all of these things. Every organization is different. But that's just to give you an example of what a balance sheet looks like. And the one thing I want to point out is that those 2 fields that are highlighted in light green, your total assets and your total liabilities plus net assets, those 2 amounts should equal or your balance sheet doesn't balance. So just noting that. And then next slide, please. And then this is a sample income statement or profit and loss or statement of operations. So it should cover the full fiscal year, the full 12 months. You list your income by source. So some of you may get individual donations. You may have received some grants. You may have membership dues. It just kind of depends on what type of organization you are. And then these are just some common types of expenses. And your net income or your net loss, which is also known as your change in net assets, that is your total income minus your total expenses. Next slide. And then this is a sample budget. It doesn't have to be this detailed. It can just be, list your different revenue, your different expenses, and your total budget column. That's fine. But it should be your best realistic estimate of the funding that you expect to receive in the current fiscal year and what you will spend it on. And I know it's common practice for your budget to balance to 0, but I'm just going to say it doesn't have to balance to 0. It's very rare that your income and your expenses are exactly the same for a fiscal year, but I know that's common practice. So yeah, just letting you know, it doesn't have to equal 0. Yeah. just what your realistic estimate is of what you think is going to come, what money is going to be received, how it's going to be spent, and then the difference between the two is your net income or net loss. Any questions on those financial forms? Any, either our own form or the 3 reports that you would have to submit if you don't fill out that form? And I
And also,
Oh, sorry. I was just
So
gonna
a
say,
quick-
I'm also happy to answer questions if you're not sure about something when you're filling out the application, or you're not sure if, you know, one of your reports is what we want. You're welcome to email me and send them to me, and I can take a look and give you feedback.
I was just gonna say really quickly, that we know that you don't have your budget for next year. It depends on your calendar, fiscal calendar, but you're probably already in the middle of your budget if you started your budget in January 2025. So that is the budget we are asking. So you're for the whole year though, not for your what is it? Day month to day?
Year to date, yeah.
Yeah. But we know you probably already have a version of this somewhere. Hopefully you're not, unless you're new, which then you're creating your application, your budget for the application.
I think that is at the end of the financial section. Alma, are there any other financial slides?
Let me, okay, thank you.
I'm gonna hop off then, but happy to answer questions that may come up for people on the finances. Thank you.
Thank you, Trina. I also already went over these. A reminder, there are branching questions, so it should guide you. So hopefully you don't need to remember to click on this. So it will tell you that it's a required question. And again, character limits are not the minimum. They are there as a limit. So the maximum. You don't need to reach the character limit. And then remember that you are asked to upload files in those respective questions when they come up. Another overview of narrative questions. These are changes, but I think they're not big enough to remind you. Again, we're looking for community support, community-wide, community impact. Oh, we do have a diversity chart, so this is kind of small to see though. I'm gonna try to zoom in. And we do have a Spanish one, but this one is not in Spanish. So reach out and I can send the Spanish version to you if you need to fill that out. But essentially this is self-identified. So please ask the people in your leadership how they want to identify, if they want to share this information. You do not need to share all of this information. But we do look at the diversity chart, and especially around our priority areas. And we do ask that you fill one out to the best of your ability. If there are specific concerns or things you would like to share in a narrative, but not in a diversity chart, do reach out to us. If there's any questions or concerns around there. But essentially, we mainly want to know your leadership, so your staff, board. We typically definitely want to hear if you have 2 co-directors. We want to know both of their, or however they want to identify themselves in this form. And also your board. Your staff, if you want to share that, that is also enough there. But we definitely focus more on board and co-directors or executive directors or the one director. So this is an example of how someone would fill this out. And we ask for age because sometimes youth, so if we're looking at youth focused after school programs, then we want to look at youth programs, but if it were like an elder based culture organizing project, then we would just want to know who's the elders or who are the people most impacted and how do they identify, whether it's age or another identifier. So we will let you know if we need additional information. Depending on how many applications come early, we will reach out soon earlier if you submit. Otherwise, you'll hear from us after September 15th. Mostly financials or diversity chart or leadership bios is where we follow up because those are important to us. But you have space to kind of be in conversation with us after you submit your application. And now we have reminder of deadline. Again, contact information. Hannah Rose has been good, I think, putting it in the chat, but it's also here. And we are not looking for, or sorry, we have a giving project, but this round it will be alumni giving project members. So people who have done the giving project in the past will be doing mostly the grant making and a little bit of the fundraising. But we will be doing outreach for the spring giving project. So if you enjoyed this or would like to be part of that group, you can also reach out for questions around the giving project if that's something you would be interested in or a professional development opportunity for someone you know or your staff. That's also there. Okay, I think we are done. So any final questions or comments? Maybe feedback, if you have any. Let me stop sharing. Oh. Well, thank you all for your time. We look forward to reading your application if you allow us. And also if you want to check in before, as long as it's before September 15, I'm open for questions. Otherwise, we would be reaching out to you if we need something or we are missing something. I guess I'll stay with Hannah Rose as we close out, but if anyone else has any questions, you're also welcome to stay behind. Otherwise, thank you all for your time and I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon.